The morning Susan Abernathy knocked on my door at 7:45 in the morning. She had no idea she was about to light the fuse on the worst month of her life. She was standing there in her puffy red coat, clipboard in hand, breath coming out in little white puffs like a dragon who had just discovered homeowner association bylaws. It was early December, maybe 12 degrees outside, and the snow that had fallen overnight was still sitting heavy and untouched on every surface in Pinecrest Estates. She had that look on her face, that particular look that every HOA enforcer seems to be born with, a mixture of smug certainty and barely disguised glee. Like she had been waiting for this moment, like she had circled this day on her calendar. I had just come back inside from warming up my truck. I owned a lifted F350 diesel engine, and anyone who has ever owned a diesel in serious winter weather knows that those engines do not love cold starts. You warm them up. You let the glow plugs do their job. You keep the block heater going, and you let the engine reach a reasonable operating temperature before you ask it to move 16,000 pounds of combined truck weight and trailer. That is not laziness. That is basic mechanical responsibility. My truck sat in my own driveway, on my own concrete, not blocking anyone, not making excessive noise, just idling quietly with its exhaust curling up into the frozen December air. Susan Abernathy had a problem with that. I opened the door before she could knock a second time, because I had already spotted her through the window walking up my driveway with that clipboard held out in front of her like a shield. "Mr. Russell," she said, not even a good morning, not even a hello, just launching right into it. "I'm here on behalf of the Pinecrest Estates HOA. We've received a complaint about your vehicle idling in your driveway." I looked at her. I looked at my truck. I looked back at her. "You received a complaint at 7:45 in the morning. The complaint was filed last night," she said, in anticipation of the behavior. And there it was. The complaint had been filed before I even started the truck. That told me everything I needed to know about what this actually was. This was not about noise ordinances or air quality or any legitimate concern. This was Susan Abernathy finding a reason to knock on my door and remind me who she thought was in charge around here. I should back up and explain how Ray Russell ended up in Pinecrest Estates, because it matters. About 4 years ago, I bought a house in this subdivision outside of Millbrook, which is a mid-sized town in the northern Midwest where winter is not a suggestion, it is a commitment. Pinecrest Estates is a nice neighborhood, well-maintained, good roads, decent neighbors. The HOA exists, which is unavoidable in subdivisions like this, and for the first couple of years it mostly left me alone. I paid my dues, kept my lawn mowed, painted my fence the approved shade of dark gray, and minded my own business. What Susan Abernathy did not know, and what most of my neighbors did not know either, because I am not the type of guy who walks around announcing his business ventures, was that I owned Russell Road Services, LLC. I had started the company 7 years prior with one plow truck and a used salt spreader. By the time Susan knocked on my door that December morning, Russell Road Services had grown to a fleet of 11 vehicles. We had 6 full-sized plow trucks, 2 skid steers with snow removal attachments, 2 salt trucks, and 1 dedicated loader for larger commercial lots. We had contracts with the county, 3 local municipalities, a shopping center, 2 apartment complexes, and, importantly, Pinecrest Estates itself. That last one is the part that matters. The HOA had been contracting with Russell Road Services for 3 years running. They had signed the most recent contract in October, just 6 weeks before Susan knocked on my door. It was a seasonal contract for snow removal throughout all of Pinecrest Estates, covering all interior roadways, the main entrance, the cul-de-sacs, and the community mailbox areas. The contract value was just over $18,000 for the season, which ran October through April. I had not made a point of telling anyone in the neighborhood that I was the owner of the company. My fleet was branded with the Russell Road Services logo, a blue diamond with a snowflake and a plow blade, but people tend not to think hard about whose name is on the truck plowing their street at 5 in the morning. Back to Susan, on my doorstep. I'm going to need you to review Section 4, Subsection C of the Pinecrest Estates Community Guidelines, she said, producing a laminated sheet from her clipboard. She actually had it laminated. She handed it to me, and I stood there in my doorway holding a laminated sheet while the cold air came pouring in past her. I read it. Section 4, Subsection C said that homeowners should minimize unnecessary vehicle idling in residential areas to maintain air quality and minimize noise disturbance for neighbors. The key word there, which Susan had apparently decided to gloss over, was should. It was a recommendation, not a rule, not an enforceable prohibition, a suggestion dressed up in official language and presented as law by a woman with a clipboard and a laminated sheet. Susan, I said, keeping my voice very even, this says should. That's not a violation. The spirit of the guideline is clear, Mr. Russell. The spirit and the letter are two different things. I'm authorized to issue a formal advisory notice, she said, and she pulled another sheet from her clipboard, this one not laminated but still very official looking, and handed it to me. It had my address, my name, the date, the time, a description of the alleged violation, and a signature block for me to sign acknowledging receipt. I did not sign it. I took it. I told her I would review it with my attorney if needed, and I closed the door. Now here is what I should have done. I should have just let it go, kept warming my truck every morning, and ignored the advisory notice. The document had no teeth. She could not fine me for a should. If she had tried to escalate it to an actual fine, I could have contested it in about 10 minutes flat because the language did not support enforcement. But Susan Abernathy was not done with me, not even close, and over the next 2 weeks, she escalated things in ways that forced my hand. The first escalation came 3 days later. I came outside to warm my truck at 7:30 in the morning and found a second advisory notice tucked under my windshield wiper. Same complaint. Idling vehicle. This time it had been escalated from an advisory to a formal notice of noncompliance, which was apparently a step up in their internal hierarchy. This one had a note attached saying that continued noncompliance could result in fines beginning at $50 per occurrence. I photographed it, dated and timestamped the photo on my phone, and went inside to start a folder. The second escalation came a week later. I got a letter from the HOA, signed by Susan in her capacity as compliance officer, which was apparently a role she had appointed herself to, stating that the HOA board had reviewed my case and agreed that I was in violation of community standards. The letter requested that I attend a board meeting on December 14th at 7 p.m. in the community clubhouse to address the matter. I read that letter 3 times. They had escalated a non-binding guideline into a board-level matter in less than 2 weeks. This was no longer about my truck. Something else was going on. I started asking around the neighborhood quietly. I talked to my neighbor Dave, who lived 2 houses down, a retired school principal who had been in Pinecrest Estates since the neighborhood was built. Dave told me that Susan had been on a tear lately, that she had been pushing the board to revise the HOA fee structure, and that there were rumors she wanted to bring certain services in-house instead of contracting them out, including snow removal. That lit a small alarm bell in my head. I talked to another neighbor, a younger woman named Priya who worked in real estate and had her ear to the ground on HOA politics. She told me Susan had a brother-in-law who owned a landscaping company. The brother-in-law had recently gotten a snowplow attachment for his equipment and was looking to break into the snow removal business. He had apparently approached the HOA about a contract, but the board had said they were already locked in with Russell Road services through the current season. And there it was. The full picture came into focus. Susan had been hassling me about warming my truck not because she cared about air quality, but because she was trying to manufacture a conflict with me, something she could use as leverage or as a reason to claim I was a difficult contractor to work with. She wanted to create grounds to void the contract and hand it to her brother-in-law. I will admit I sat on that information for a couple of days. Not because I was unsure what to do, but because I wanted to make sure I understood exactly what I was walking into before I showed up at that board meeting on December 14th. I called my attorney, a sharp woman named Carla Torres who specialized in contract and property law, and I explained the whole situation to her. Carla listened without interrupting, and when I was done she made a sound that I can only describe as delighted. She told me to gather everything I had, bring it to the meeting, and to say as little as possible until the right moment. I also made a point to look up the HOA bylaws in detail, not just the idling guideline, all of it. 47 pages of Pinecrest Estates community governance documents. I read them all over 2 evenings with a cup of coffee and a highlighter. What I found was interesting. The HOA had the authority to issue fines for violations of clearly stated rules, but only with a documented written warning, a waiting period of 14 days, and the opportunity for the homeowner to contest. Susan had issued the first advisory on a Thursday. The second notice of noncompliance had come on Sunday, 3 days, not 14. She had jumped the timeline by 11 days. I highlighted that section in bright yellow and added it to my folder. I also checked the HOA's authority to void service contracts. The bylaws were clear. Contracts valued over $5,000 could only be terminated by a vote of the full board, not by any individual officer, and only for documented cause. The board had 5 members. Susan was one of them. Any vote to terminate my contract would need 3 votes minimum, and it would need to be based on documented cause, meaning something I had actually done wrong in the execution of the contract. Warming my truck in my own driveway, regardless of how Susan framed it, had absolutely nothing to do with the snow removal contract. I wrote all of this down in a clean, organized document. I added the timeline of notices, the photographs with timestamps, the relevant bylaw sections, and a brief summary of the conflict of interest regarding Susan's brother-in-law. I printed 3 copies, put them in labeled manila folders, and set them by the door for the night of the meeting. December 14th arrived cold and mean. Overnight, a new front had pushed through and dropped another 4 inches of snow on Pinecrest Estates. By the time I got up at 5:30, my crews were already out. I could hear the sound of plow blades scraping asphalt 2 streets over as my guys worked their way through the subdivision, just like they had been doing every storm for 3 years. They were good, efficient, and by the time most residents had their morning coffee in hand, the roads were clear and the salt was down. I warmed my truck at 6:30 that morning just like every other morning. 8 minutes of idle time. The air temperature was 9 degrees. My exhaust hung in the cold air and drifted away on the light wind. Nobody complained, or at least nobody said anything to my face. By 7 p.m. that evening, the roads were fully cleared. The parking lot of the community clubhouse had been salted and was completely passable, and about 20 residents had gathered inside for the board meeting. That surprised me. I had not expected much of a turnout. Pinecrest Estates board meetings typically drew maybe 6 or 8 people. Tonight there were 20 or more, and when I walked in I noticed that several of them were neighbors I had spoken with over the past couple of weeks. Word had gotten around. Susan Abernathy was seated at the board table at the front of the room with 4 other board members. She had dressed up for this. She looked pleased with herself in a way that suggested she thought this evening was going to go her way. The board chair was a quiet, soft-spoken man named Gerald, who I had always found reasonable. He opened the meeting, went through a few routine items, and then got to what he called new business, which was apparently my situation, item 4 on the agenda. Susan did not wait for Gerald to hand the floor to her. She just started talking. She laid out her case against me in what I had to admit was a fairly polished presentation. She had a printed summary of the advisory notices, photographs she had taken of my truck idling in my driveway, a printout of the guideline, and a timeline of what she called repeated noncompliance. She spoke with tremendous confidence about air quality concerns, community standards, the importance of every homeowner respecting the shared nature of a residential community. She mentioned, at the end, that given this pattern of behavior, the board might want to consider whether it was appropriate to maintain a service contract with someone who demonstrated such disregard for community values. And there it was. She said it out loud in front of 20-plus residents. Gerald looked mildly uncomfortable but did not stop her. I raised my hand. Gerald nodded at me. "Mr. Russell, you'll have an opportunity to respond." I stood up. I had my folder. I kept my voice calm and friendly, because I had learned years ago that staying calm when someone expects you to be angry is one of the most effective strategies available to you. "Thanks, Gerald. Before I respond to Susan's points, I want to ask a clarifying question for the record. Is this meeting being recorded?" Gerald said yes. The board recorded all meetings per the bylaws. "Great. I'm going to ask that my response be entered into the meeting record as well. I have documentation to share." I handed copies of my folder to Gerald, to the board secretary on his left, and I kept one for myself. Then I walked through it methodically. First, the language of the guideline. I read Section 4, Subsection C out loud and emphasized the word should. I pointed out that this was not an enforceable rule but a community recommendation, and that advisory notices and notices of noncompliance could not be issued for a non-binding guideline under the HOA's own enforcement procedures, which I cited by page and section number. There was some murmuring in the room. Second, the timeline. Susan had issued the first notice on a Thursday and escalated to noncompliance on Sunday. 3 days. The bylaws required 14. I had the dates printed on a clear visual timeline so anyone in the room could follow along. More murmuring. Third, and this was the part I had been looking forward to, I brought up the conflict of interest. I stated clearly and for the record that I had received information suggesting that a family member of a current board member had approached the HOA about a snow removal contract, that this family member had been turned away because the HOA was already under contract with my company, and that the timing of the sudden enforcement action against me raised serious questions about motivation. The room got noticeably louder. I heard at least 2 people say Susan's name. Susan was on her feet. "That is completely inappropriate, and I resent the implication." "I'm not implying anything," I said pleasantly. "I'm asking the question on the record. If the answer is that there's no conflict of interest, that's great. But the question should be asked and answered before any discussion of terminating a service contract." Gerald asked Susan directly whether a family member of hers had sought a snow removal contract with the HOA. Susan tried to deflect, called it irrelevant, said my business relationship with the HOA had nothing to do with the vehicle idling matter, but Gerald pressed her. He was clearly uncomfortable and clearly aware that this meeting had turned into something much larger than he had anticipated. Susan eventually admitted that her brother-in-law Dennis had asked about the possibility of providing snow removal services. She said she had recused herself from that discussion, which was interesting because I had a statement from Priya, written and signed, that Susan had actually been the one to initially propose the idea to the board before Dennis had even made contact. I shared Priya's statement. The room was now fully buzzing. 2 of the other board members were leaning in and whispering to each other. Gerald had his head in his hands in the way that a man has when he realizes the meeting he thought would be 45 minutes is going to be 3 hours. But I was not done. I had saved the most important piece for the end, and I delivered it with as little drama as possible, which somehow made it hit harder. I told the room who I was. Not just Ray Russell, the homeowner. Ray Russell, the owner of Russell Road Services, LLC, the company that had been plowing every single road in Pinecrest Estates for the past 3 seasons. The company that had cleared the roads that very morning when 9 degrees and 4 inches of snow had tried to make this meeting impossible to get to. The company whose trucks were why nobody had to cancel their evening plans or dig their cars out of an unplowed cul-de-sac to get here tonight. I pulled out the contract. I had brought a clean copy. I held it up. This contract runs through April 30th. It was signed in October by the HOA board chair, which is Gerald, who I want to be clear has been nothing but professional with me throughout this. Under the terms of this contract and under the HOA bylaws, this contract can only be terminated for documented cause by a majority board vote. Warming my truck in my own driveway is not a cause for contract termination. And if anyone tries to terminate this contract without valid cause, I have legal counsel already briefed and ready to pursue breach of contract. The silence in that room was extraordinary. Then someone in the back started clapping. Slow at first, just one person, but it spread. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to make Susan Abernathy look around the room and realize that the script she had written for this evening had gone completely off the rails. Gerald called for a recess. During the recess, I stood by the coffee table at the back of the room and talked to neighbors. The reaction was better than I had expected. People were not just sympathetic, they were annoyed on my behalf, and some of them were annoyed at the HOA more broadly. Several people mentioned other run-ins with Susan. Dave, my neighbor, the retired principal, told me he had gotten an advisory notice last summer about his garden hose being left coiled on his front steps. Another couple, the Hendersons from the end of Pinecrest Lane, said Susan had sent them a letter about the color of their Christmas lights being too bright and potentially disruptive to the community aesthetic. This was a pattern. Susan Abernathy had been running a low-grade campaign of harassment against residents she did not like for at least a year, and nobody had pushed back because nobody had known how. They had assumed the HOA had authority it did not actually have, and Susan had been happy to let that assumption stand. When the meeting reconvened, Gerald announced that the board would be tabling the matter of the vehicle idling guideline, pending a full legal review of the HOA's enforcement procedures. He looked tired, and I felt slightly bad for him, because Gerald was genuinely a decent person caught in a situation Susan had created. He also announced, somewhat stiffly, that the board would be reviewing the conflict of interest allegations regarding the snow removal contract discussion and would report back to the community. Susan Abernathy said nothing during the second half of the meeting. She sat very still and looked at her laminated sheets, and when the meeting adjourned she left quickly without making eye contact with anyone. I thought that was probably the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days after the meeting, I received a certified letter from the HOA, signed only by Susan, not by the full board, stating that my company was in breach of the snow removal contract because we had allegedly failed to clear the Pinecrest Estates main entrance road to the contracted standard during the December 14th storm. The letter claimed there had been ice left on the entrance road that posed a safety hazard. It stated that the HOA was placing the contract on formal notice of potential termination. I read that letter twice and then I called Carla. Carla told me to pull my GPS data, my crew logs, and any photographs from the December 14th service run before I did anything else. My trucks have GPS tracking, all of them. I implemented it 3 years ago primarily for fleet management and fuel efficiency, but it also happens to create a time-stamped record of exactly where each truck was, when it arrived, what route it took, and how long it spent in each location. The GPS data for December 14th showed that my crew had serviced the Pinecrest Estates main entrance road at 5:47 in the morning, had made 2 full passes with the plow blade, and had applied a salt spread on the exit. The service lasted 22 minutes. The entrance road met every specification in the contract. I also had photographs. My lead driver, a guy named Marcus who had been with me since year 2, had a habit of taking photos at job sites after completion. He called it his end-of-shift documentation, and I had always encouraged it. He had 4 clear photographs of the Pinecrest Estates entrance road taken at 6:11 a.m. on December 14th. Plowed, clear, salted, exactly as contracted. And then I did something Susan had not counted on. I pulled the HOA's own security camera footage. Pinecrest Estates had 2 cameras on the main entrance, installed about 18 months ago by the HOA for general security purposes. I knew about those cameras because I had been the one to suggest the board consider entrance cameras at a meeting 2 years prior. The cameras were managed by a third-party security service, and the footage was accessible to the HOA board members. Here is what was interesting. Those cameras had captured the entrance road on December 14th. The footage, which I requested through proper channels by having Carla send a formal discovery preservation notice to the HOA, showed the road at 6:15 a.m., clear and treated, exactly matching Marcus's photos. The footage also showed, and this was the part that made Carla use a word I will not repeat here when she saw it, Susan Abernathy's car arriving at the main entrance at 7:22 a.m. She had gotten out of her car. She had looked around. And then she had poured something from a container onto the road surface near the entrance apron. She had poured water onto the treated road surface, in 9-degree weather, to create ice, to manufacture evidence of a contract breach that did not exist. I sat with that footage for about 20 minutes before I called Carla again. Carla was quiet for a moment, and then she said, very carefully, that what Susan had done constituted intentional property tampering and potentially criminal mischief, and that by creating a hazardous icy surface on a road used by residents and vehicles, she had also created a potential premises liability issue that the HOA itself would be exposed to. Carla said we needed to think carefully about how to proceed, because this had moved well past an HOA dispute into potential criminal territory. I agreed with her. And I also thought about the safety angle. The manufactured ice Susan had created on that entrance road had been there for the duration of the morning when residents were leaving for work. If anyone had slipped or if a car had slid on that patch, someone could have been hurt. That was not a minor consideration. That was the thing that removed any remaining sympathy I might have had for Susan and turned this into something I was not willing to let slide. We went to the police. Carla and I met with a detective at the Millbrook Police Department on December 17th. We brought the GPS data, Marcus's photos, the security camera footage, the HOA letter alleging the contract breach, and a written timeline of everything that had happened from the first advisory notice forward. The detective, a thorough and patient man named Kowalski, watched the security footage twice. He asked several clarifying questions about the camera system, the footage chain of custody, and what the substance in the container appeared to be. He told us he would need to review the footage with his supervisor and potentially loop in the county prosecutor, but that based on what he was seeing, he had grounds to open an investigation. The investigation moved faster than I expected. By December 20th, Detective Kowalski had interviewed 2 of Susan's immediate neighbors who had seen her leave her house that morning with a large jug she sometimes used for outdoor plants. By December 21st, a search warrant had been executed, and the jug was found in Susan's garage. It still had water residue in it, and the GPS data from Susan's own phone, which was obtained as part of the warrant, placed her at the entrance road at exactly the time shown on the security footage. Susan Abernathy was charged on December 23rd with criminal mischief and reckless endangerment. She was arraigned, released on bail, and ordered to have no contact with me, my property, or my business. The HOA board, now in a state of near-total chaos, convened an emergency meeting on December 27th without Susan, who was of course not able to participate given the no-contact order and the active charges against her. Gerald chaired it. 4 board members were present. 2 other residents attended in the gallery, including Dave and Priya. The board formally rescinded every advisory notice and non-compliance notice Susan had issued against me. They acknowledged in the written minutes that those notices had not been issued in accordance with the HOA's own enforcement procedures. They confirmed that the snow removal contract with Russell Road Services was valid, in full effect, and would be honored through April 30th as agreed. They also passed a resolution requiring that any future conflict of interest involving a board member's family relationships with potential HOA vendors be disclosed in writing, and that the board member in question be formally recused from any related discussions or votes. Gerald called me the next day to apologize personally. I told him I appreciated it and that I had no issue with him, which was true. He asked me what it would take to make things right. I told him the contract being honored was enough and that I hoped the community could move forward. What happened with Susan was not quick, but it was thorough. The criminal case moved through the court system over the following months. She eventually pleaded no contest to criminal mischief in the 3rd degree, which avoided a trial but resulted in a formal conviction. She was sentenced to 12 months of supervised probation, fined $1,500, and ordered to perform 120 hours of community service. As part of the plea agreement, she also resigned from the HOA board, which was not technically required by the court, but which the HOA bylaws required once a board member received a criminal conviction. The board had actually amended the bylaws at their January meeting to make that automatic, partly in response to the whole situation, and partly because 2 of the other board members had been embarrassed enough by the incident to push for governance reforms across the board. The brother-in-law Dennis, for what it is worth, never did get a snow removal contract with anyone in Millbrook. Word travels in this business and nobody wants to be associated with the family of someone who was convicted for tampering with a road surface. He eventually sold his plow attachment on a used equipment website the following spring. Back to life in Pinecrest Estates. The rest of that winter was actually pretty remarkable, in a good way. Once the dust settled from all of it, something shifted in the neighborhood. Residents who had been keeping their heads down and quietly resenting the HOA's heavy-handed approach started showing up to meetings. By February, the board had 3 new faces, including Priya, who ran unopposed for the open seat left by Susan's resignation. Dave was elected to a 2nd seat. A 3rd resident, a young engineer named Tom from the Birchwood section of the neighborhood, took the 5th seat and immediately started proposing sensible updates to the bylaw language. I kept warming my truck every morning. 8 minutes, maybe 10 if it was especially brutal out. Nobody said a word about it. The January storm season was one of the heavier ones in recent memory. We had 3 significant events in the first 2 weeks, back to back, each one dropping 6 to 8 inches. My crews were out before dawn every single time. Marcus and his guys ran the Pinecrest Estates routes with the same efficiency they always had. The roads were clear before most people woke up. The mailbox areas were accessible. The cul-de-sacs got done without shortcuts. I drove the routes myself twice that month just to make sure everything was exactly as contracted, not because I was nervous, but because I take pride in the work, and I wanted to see the results firsthand in the cold early morning quiet. There is something genuinely satisfying about driving through a neighborhood at 5:30 a.m. after a fresh plow run. The roads are clean and dark against the white landscape. The salt treatment glitters faintly under the streetlights, and you know that in a couple of hours a few hundred people are going to back out of their driveways and drive to work without ever thinking about how the road got that way. That invisibility used to bother me a little. After all of this, it did not anymore. I knew. My guys knew. And the residents of Pinecrest Estates, a good number of them anyway, now knew too. I got a dozen texts and handwritten notes over January and February from neighbors thanking me for the work. Dave left a case of decent beer on my front steps after a particularly rough 3-day stretch with a note that said, "From everyone on Maple Crest, thanks for keeping us moving." The Hendersons, whose Christmas lights had apparently offended Susan's aesthetic sensibilities, put up even bigger and brighter lights that January, which was not technically a Christmas thing anymore, but which everyone seemed to enjoy anyway. The HOA board, the new one, reached out to Carla in March to discuss formalizing the relationship between Russell Road Services and Pinecrest Estates on better terms. They wanted a multi-year agreement with clear service specifications, a defined dispute resolution process, and a mutual acknowledgement of the contractor's independence as a business operating under contract rather than a vendor subject to HOA governance. It was exactly the kind of professional, sensible arrangement that should have existed from the beginning. We signed a 3-year deal in April, the day after the seasonal contract expired, at a slightly better rate per season that reflected the multi-year commitment. Carla told me it was one of the cleanest contracts she had reviewed in years. I told her that was partly because I had learned a lot about contract language from reading 47 pages of HOA bylaws with a highlighter over 2 evenings in December. She laughed and said I should consider going to law school. I told her I was happy with trucks. There is a larger thing here that I keep coming back to when I think about how all of this unfolded. Susan Abernathy was not operating in a vacuum. She had been doing this stuff, the nitpicking, the manipulation, the advisory notices for non-binding guidelines, the campaign of low-level harassment, for at least a year before she tried it on me. Maybe longer. And she had gotten away with it because the people she targeted either did not know their rights, did not want the hassle of fighting back, or assumed that the HOA had authority it did not actually have. She had counted on the same thing with me. She had looked at a guy warming his truck in his driveway and assumed he would either comply quietly or disappear. She had not done her homework. She had not asked who that truck belonged to, who the guy was, what he did for a living, or what legal and contractual relationships might exist between him and the very HOA she was representing. That is a fundamental mistake that people in positions of petty authority make all the time. They assume that because they have a clipboard and a laminated sheet, they are the most informed person in the conversation. They assume that the person they are going after has fewer resources, less knowledge, and less patience than they do. Sometimes that is true. With me, it was not. I am not a lawyer. I am not a wealthy man. I own a trucking and snow removal business in the Midwest, and I work hard for every contract I have. But I know my rights. I read what I sign, I keep documentation, and I have the sense to hire good counsel when the situation calls for it. That combination, which is available to anyone willing to put in the effort, is more than enough to handle a Susan Abernathy. The criminal charges were, I want to be clear, not something I went looking for. If she had just accepted the outcome of the December 14th board meeting and backed off, I would have moved on. I did not enjoy being the reason someone faced criminal charges. It is not satisfying in the way that some people might imagine. What the charges reflected was that she had escalated past the point where I had a choice. Pouring water on a treated road in 9-degree weather to create artificial ice so that she could allege a contract breach that did not exist was not a paperwork dispute or a governance argument. It was dangerous. It was deliberate. And it could not just be ignored. The satisfaction, if there is any, is not in the charges. It is in the outcome for the community. The residents of Pinecrest Estates got an HOA board that actually served their interests, governance documents that meant what they said, and a service contractor relationship built on professionalism and mutual respect. That is the outcome that matters. I ran into Gerald at the hardware store in March. He was buying weather stripping for his garage door, which is a very normal thing to do after a Midwest winter, and we talked for a few minutes by the door seal's aisle. He said the new board was doing well, that the meetings had better attendance than they had in years, and that the community generally felt more settled. He seemed lighter than he had at any point during the whole ordeal. I was glad for him. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that someone had suggested naming one of the community's roads after me as a thank you gesture. He said he had gently talked them out of it on the grounds that it might be awkward. I told him I appreciated the thought and that I was fine without a street named after me. He said the truck warming, though, was fully resolved right. I told him it had never been a real issue to begin with. He laughed and shook his head and went back to his weather stripping, and I went to find the chain lubricant I had come in for, and that was that. By the time April came around and the snow removal season officially ended, things in Pinecrest Estates had found their natural level. The roads were clear, the HOA was functioning like it was supposed to, and my trucks were sitting in the yard getting their spring maintenance done in preparation for the landscaping contracts that kept us busy through the summer and fall. On the last morning of April, before the weather turned warm enough to make it unnecessary, I went out to start my truck at 7 a.m. It was still cold, a late frost that had surprised everyone, and the diesel needed its warm-up time. I stood in the driveway for 8 minutes and watched the exhaust curl up into the pale spring sky and listened to the engine tick and rumble through its warm-up cycle. Nobody knocked on my door. Nobody put a note under my wiper. Nobody filed a preemptive complaint the night before. The neighborhood was quiet and normal and mine, and 8 minutes later I put it in reverse and went on with my day. That is really all there is to it. A woman with a clipboard and a vendetta picked the wrong target, pushed too far, and found out that the guy she was targeting had the receipts, the resources, and the patience to let it all unravel in front of everyone. The roads got plowed. The contract got honored. The community came out stronger for the whole messy business. And every morning that winter, without fail, I warmed my truck. I do not think I will ever stop finding that satisfying. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Know what your HOA can and cannot actually do. Read the bylaws. Read the actual language of the rules, not the summary that someone with a clipboard presents to you on a laminated sheet. Keep documentation of everything. Photograph notices with timestamps. Keep a folder. And when someone tells you that you are in violation of something, ask them to show you exactly where. Make them point to the specific language. Because half the time, in my experience, the language does not say what they claim it says, and the other half of the time, the enforcement procedure they are using violates the very bylaws they are supposedly protecting. Susan Abernathy knew the intimidation playbook really well. She just did not know the actual rules. And when someone who does know the actual rules finally showed up, the whole thing came apart faster than a light snow cover on a salted road. I have 3 new contracts lined up for next season. One of them is the renewed 3-year deal with Pinecrest Estates. Every October I will sign that contract. Every winter my trucks will plow those roads and spread that salt and clear those cul-de-sacs before anyone is awake. And every morning when the temperature drops below 20, I will walk out to my driveway and start my diesel and let it warm up for 8 minutes. Because that is how you treat a diesel in December. And because sometimes the most satisfying thing you can do is simply keep doing exactly what you were doing before someone tried to stop you.